The wind was sharp, not cold, but sharp, like the breath of steel slicing through cloth. Sergeant Otto Neumann gripped the straps tighter. Above him, the hum of the Junkers 52 droned like an ancient god grumbling before a storm. Below, only clouds and the unknown. He was 23 and about to jump into fire. Imagine that. You're not even old enough to forget your first heartbreak, and you're already falling from the sky, hoping the ground doesn't open up and swallow your entire soul? Silêncio. Baque, uma luz vermelha acesa. And then, green. Otto jumped. But Otto wasn't alone. He was part of something bigger, a storm stitched into a uniform. The Fallschirmjäger, Germany's airborne elite, men forged with Prussian steel and suicide in their lungs. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the untold story of World War II paratroopers, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapters. They weren't just soldiers, they were symbols. But what does it mean to become a symbol when your blood becomes ink for someone else's story? In the early years of the Reich, Hitler saw in them not just paratroopers, but an image, an icon, the spearhead of tomorrow's war. And he needed that, a myth, dressed in gray, falling from the heavens like wrath. They trained for years, without mercy, without shortcuts. Legend says that even training accidents were dismissed with a single phrase. If he died training, he wasn't ready to fight. Brutal? Maybe, but how else do you forge men who leap straight into machine gun fire and keep moving? Let me tell you about Corporal Heinz Becker, a former metal worker from Essen. His first jump, he landed in a tree, broke both legs, and crawled 2 kilometers to reach the rally point. They promoted him. Why? Because in this army, suffering wasn't a bug, it was a feature. But hold on. That begs the question, what kind of war demands this level of obedience, this absolute disregard for the self? They called it honor, discipline, fatherland. But I ask you, is it really courage when the only choice is forward? The Fallschirmjäger were not just a tactical innovation, they were psychological warfare. The sound of boots hitting rooftops, the sudden chaos from above, the whispered terror in Allied trenches that could be anywhere, even the sky. Their first major deployment? Norway, then Belgium, then the Netherlands, each time a masterclass in shock and awe. But with every victory came a new layer of myth. And myths are dangerous things. They don't die when men do. They live on, twisting, and sometimes choking those who try to live up to them. Was the Fallschirmjäger truly elite, or just the first to be sacrificed at the altar of ambition? Because behind every medal, there was a hospital bed. Behind every headline, a mother's telegram. And behind every myth, a man like Otto. A man who, in the end, never made it back from his second jump. The sky gave him wings, but the Reich gave him no place to land. So I leave you with this. They were the first to fall, the first to fight, the first to carry the weight of a symbol heavier than any weapon. But were they heroes of a future or martyrs of a mistake? The answer fell with them into the fire. And Crete was waiting.
May 20th, 1941. The sun over Crete was blinding, almost mocking, its brightness slicing through the blue like a blade of truth. Below, olive trees swayed with an eerie calm. Above, the sky cracked open. Thousands of black dots began to fall. Not rain, not bombs, men. Kurt Student watched from a command post in Greece, binoculars clenched in white-knuckled fists. This was his masterpiece, Operation Mercure, Mercury, named after the god of speed. But the gods had other plans. The gamble was simple and insane. take an island defended by thousands of Allied troops and drop in elite paratroopers without tanks, without support, without a second chance. Because if they didn't succeed in hours, they'd be slaughtered in days. And yet, Student believed. He had seen what the Fallschirmjäger could do. He trusted in surprise, in violence, in fear as a weapon. But war doesn't always follow the script of confidence. The moment their boots hit the dust of Crete, everything unraveled. British and New Zealand forces were waiting, armed, angry, dug in. And unlike the cities of Belgium or the fields of Norway, Crete had teeth, sharp ones, and it bit back. Corporal Dieter Helvig landed outside Malem. His chute tangled in a tree, he cut himself down into a hail of bullets. He never saw the man who shot him. And he wasn't alone. In the first 48 hours, the Fallschirmjäger lost nearly 4,000 men. Whole units vanished before they could regroup, equipment lost, medics overwhelmed, communication broken. Silence, chaos, screams under the sun. And still, they fought. Because that's what they were trained to do. Even when the plan collapses, the myth demands they hold. Even when the mission is bleeding out on the rocks, you are not allowed to. But what broke them wasn't just bullets, it was the betrayal of belief. The student had believed in them. Hitler? Not anymore. When the battle finally tilted in Germany's favor, when airfields were seized and the Allies began to retreat, the cost had already metastasized. A tactical win, but a strategic hemorrhage. Hitler saw the body count, saw the chaos, and in a moment that would echo through every airborne unit to come, he forbade any further large-scale airborne assaults. The Fallschirmjäger would never fly like that again, from sky kings to grounded ghosts. But imagine this. You trained to fall from heaven, to strike like thunder, and now you're told to crawl with the rest. No more sky, no more glory, just dirt, blood, marching orders, and silence. So I ask you, what kind of victory leaves your wings clipped and your soul buried beside it? Was Crete a triumph, or the graveyard of everything that made them elite? Because after that sunlit slaughter, the Fallschirmjäger were no longer feared for how they arrived. What do you think? Was Crete a triumph or a disaster? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. Only for how they died. And still, the myth grew louder.
They used to say the Fallschirmjäger didn't bleed like normal men. But Sergeant Klaus Voss knew better. He remembered the sound of it, the wet crack of bone, the gurgled breath of a friend who couldn't finish his last sentence. Monte Cassino, 1944. The monastery burned like a cathedral of ash, and the myth burned with it. But let's go back. Back to when the myth was still alive, to when Rommel called them the fireproof soldiers, to when even Allied propaganda warned of Nazi paratroopers who never surrender. Discipline? Sure. They trained until their fingers bled, jumped until their knees buckled, drilled until even the rain saluted them. But somewhere along the line, obedience became worship, and worship became blindness. You ever hear of the Milgram experiment? The one where people kept shocking others because a man in a lab coat told them to? Now imagine that, but instead of a lab coat, it's an eagle on a uniform. And the shock?
is a machine gun. Private Ernst Müller once refused to retreat from a collapsing hill position. He radioed back the same sentence 3 times. Fallschirmjäger, do not withdraw. He died with that radio in his hand. No medals, just myth. But here's the thing, myths don't keep you warm in winter. Myths don't feed you when you're surrounded. And myths don't give you permission to stop. By the time they reached Monte Cassino, they weren't elite anymore. They were desperate, under-equipped, forgotten. Still, they held. Still, they obeyed. Because to abandon the image was to admit it was never real. What's worse, dying for a country or living for a lie? Inside every helmet was a face, young, scared, and conditioned to believe that breaking was betrayal. Even Rommel, who respected them deeply, used them like scalpels, thrown into impossible tasks because they could handle it. But that respect, it came with a curse. The better they performed, the more they were punished with missions no one else could survive. So they pushed, again and again. Not for victory, but because the myth didn't allow anything else. And that's the danger, isn't it? When your own story traps you? When the armor you wear isn't steel, but pride? I ask you now, were they truly fighting for Germany? Or for the image that Germany created of them? Because by 1944, even that image was cracking. And what emerged from the ruins of Monte Cassino wasn't a super soldier. It was a survivor. Eyes hollow, rifle empty, myth broken. The abbey stood like a sentinel, ancient, silent, sacred. And then it was hell. Smoke rose from its shattered bones like incense from a funeral pyre. And inside, buried beneath rubble and fire, the Fallschirmjäger dug in, not by choice, by order. Heinz Meyer, just 26, already a veteran of 3 fronts, stood in the crypt when the first artillery shell cracked the ceiling. Dust rained like snow. He didn't flinch, not because he was brave, because the order was simple. Do not retreat. Imagine that. No exit, no rotation, no reinforcement, just walls, just fire, just death. But they stayed, not for strategy, not for some high command chess move. They stayed because pride made them prisoners, and silence was the new chain of command. The Allies bombed for days. Screaming steel tore through frescoes, columns, centuries of history, and still the Fallschirmjäger held the line. Why? Because Meyer had looked his men in the eyes, and he couldn't say the words, pull back, because what does an elite soldier become if he disobeys? Just another man. And in that place, that ruined cathedral turned fortress, being just a man meant becoming one more nameless body under the altar. But the real enemy wasn't outside. It was time. Time that dragged on with no end. Time that wore down rifles and souls. Time that whispered, "Your mission is already dead, so why are you still breathing?" Private Lentz wrote in his journal, yes, he kept one, that he had started to hear voices in the mortar blasts. He called them the ghosts of the monastery. By week 4, half his unit had trench foot, the other half had stopped writing home. Because what do you say when you're alive, but nothing around you is? Strategically, Monte Cassino meant little. The Allies would break through elsewhere. The war wouldn't be decided here. But tactically, emotionally, it broke men sharper than blades. It taught the Fallschirmjäger a final cruel lesson, that discipline without purpose becomes a slow suicide. And yet they stayed, because the order said so, because the myth said so, because sometimes the greatest prison isn't a wall, it's an identity. So I ask you, when you're fighting in ruins, for ruins, surrounded by death, is it still courage, or has it become despair? Myers survived, but when he walked out, he didn't speak for days, because when your last battle was in a cathedral of fire, what words are left? But the sky, their old ally, had already turned its back. And from here on, they'd walk. If you're finding this story powerful, don't forget to give this video a like. It really helps bring more forgotten stories of history to life. They once fell like thunder from the heavens. Now they marched in mud. After Crete, the sky was closed by order of Hitler himself. No more airborne assaults, no more shock landings, no more glory wrapped in silence. And with that single decision, the Fallschirmjäger were grounded. But grounded doesn't mean rested. It means repurposed, recycled, reassigned, turned from scalpels into blunt clubs of infantry. They called it strategic adaptation. But the truth, it was demotion in slow motion. Imagine training your whole life to fly, to leap, to land, to strike. And now you're just another rifle in the trench. No wings, no edges, no mission that fits your shape. And yet, orders are orders. Sergeant Felix Brandt felt it hard on the Eastern Front. Snow bit his face like razors. The wind screamed louder than any siren. He held a position outside Leningrad for 11 days straight. But that wasn't what broke him. It was looking across the trench and seeing new recruits from other units, barely trained, barely sober, wearing the same eagle patch. Because if everyone's elite, no one is. And that realization, it doesn't just cut, it unravels. Psychologically, they were still Fallschirmjäger. Tactically, they were grunts. And strategy, it forgot them. They were deployed like regular units. No air support, no tactical initiative, no respect for specialization. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, that once made them deadly, broken. Now, decisions came from miles away. Delayed, disconnected, deadly, not to the enemy, but to them. Private Koenig once said, "We used to be hawks, now we're moles. Digging, dying, forgotten." He didn't survive the spring. And the worst? No one cared. Not command, not the newspapers, not even the myth. Because myths have short memories, and war has new favorites every season. The Fallschirmjäger became ghosts in their own legend. Used when needed, ignored when spent. So I ask you now, what hurts more? Losing a battle or losing what you were? Because sometimes survival isn't mercy, it's exile. and exile has no parachute. But there was one man, one general, who never forgot what they were, and he was waiting in the desert. In the North African sun, war didn't whisper, it screamed. And in the chaos of sand and steel, one man stood out like a blade in the dust, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. He was ruthless, brilliant, fast like lightning, and twice as unpredictable. But more than that, he saw something others didn't. He saw the Fallschirmjäger, not just as symbols, not as relics from Crete, but as tools, sharp, efficient, reliable under pressure. While the Wehrmacht trudged through doctrine, Rommel moved like a storm, and he needed men who could match his pace, so he called them. Sicily, Narvik, Tunisia, wherever the mission demanded audacity soaked in precision, Rommel asked for paratroopers, and they delivered. Lieutenant Walter Engel led a sabotage raid against British fuel depots in North Africa. 3 men, 1 night. Explosives planted under fire. They returned with bullet holes and a victory. Rommel shook Engel's hand personally, called them the Hammer of the South. But hammering the enemy came at a cost. The more they succeeded, the more they were thrown into impossible tasks, delaying actions, suicide holds, raids with no return plan. Because excellence breeds expectation, and expectation in war is a curse. Rommel respected them, but respect wasn't armor. It didn't stop Allied tanks. It didn't refill empty ammo crates. It didn't replace the limbs they left behind in Sicily's ravines or Africa's dunes. They weren't the Wehrmacht's first choice. They were the last resort, the fire brigade for when everything else failed. And no one ever celebrates the fire brigade. They just expected to burn with the building. Private Albrecht once joked, "We're not elite, we're disposable, with style." He died at El Alamein. No statue, just sand. So let's ask the question. Were they chosen because they were honored or because they were useful enough to be sacrificed? Because when Rommel fell, so did the last man who truly saw them. And without a leader who believed, even the sharpest blade rusts. And the final chapters of the Fallschirmjäger, they were written in rubble. Berlin, 1945. There were no parachutes, no clear skies, just dust, smoke, and the sound of a city choking on its own legacy. The Fallschirmjäger were still fighting, but there was no sky left to fall from. No missions, no orders that made sense, just a crumbling capital and the echo of a myth that wouldn't let them die quietly. Corporal Lucas Adler held the upper floor of a bombed-out school. His unit had no heavy weapons, only rifles, some Molotovs, and memories of when they used to matter. The Soviets were 3 blocks away, and yet they held. Why? Habit? Pride? Or was it just momentum, the kind that keeps a dead train rolling downhill? Outside, the Reich was collapsing. Inside, discipline remained. Because when all else is ash, the uniform still tells you what to do. And for the Fallschirmjäger, that uniform wasn't just cloth, it was their cage. General der Fallschirmtruppe Hermann Bernhard Ramke gave his final order: hold every street as if it were Crete. But this wasn't Crete. There were no airfields to seize, no tides to turn, only ghosts. The Reich had used them as banners, symbols, tools. Now those same tools were broken, dulled, bent, buried beneath the ruins they once fought to conquer. And still, they fired. Still, they obeyed. Because the myth, that beautiful, poisonous myth, demanded it. Even as Berlin burned, even as children were handed rifles, even as the last artillery shells fell not on enemy lines, but on what remained of their own homes. By the time the Red Army stormed the Reichstag, what was left of the Fallschirmjäger wasn't elite. It was exhausted. It was shattered, and yet still strangely feared. Because they didn't stop. They never stopped. And maybe that's the tragedy. Not that they died, but that they couldn't stop fighting even when the war had already stopped making sense. And now, what remains of an ideal when its symbol has bled out? A patch on a collector's uniform, a chapter in a forgotten manual. A question with no easy answer. Were they heroes, fools, victims, or something far more haunting? The last believers in a war that had stopped believing in them. And as the dust of Berlin settled, one truth rose like smoke. The sky had betrayed its warriors. They were supposed to be gods of war. They fell from the clouds like wrath incarnate, fast, precise, untouchable. But war is cruel to believers, and crueler still to symbols. The Fallschirmjäger didn't just descend from airplanes. They descended from hope, from the belief that courage could rewrite strategy, that discipline could outrun reality, that falling faster meant winning sooner. But the ground has no mercy, and neither does history. Because the truth is, they were warriors trapped in a paradox. Their bravery was real, their sacrifice was total, but their purpose, it was borrowed, twisted by propaganda, used by command, eaten by a war that demanded legends but fed on flesh. They became proof that valor isn't enough. You can train harder, fight better, jump first. But if the strategy is broken, if the vision is blind, then no amount of bravery will save you. They were elite, but they were not invincible. They were precise, but they were not protected. They were loyal, but they were not spared. Their legacy? It survives in ruins, in faded photographs, in the silence between shell impacts. A silence that asks us, when is the last time you questioned the mission before you jumped? Because sometimes the deadliest fall isn't from the sky. It's from blind faith. And the Fallschirmjäger, they proved one final truth. In modern war, courage is only as strong as the cause behind it. And without that, you're not falling into battle. You're falling into memory. If you want to see more stories like this, history told through the eyes of those who lived it, subscribe now and join the community. And don't forget to comment your thoughts below.